What happens when a woman who has been called the queen of country music for 4 decades, who survived unimaginable tragedy and rebuilt her life from the ashes, sits down for what should be a celebratory interview only to have everything she stands for attacked and dismissed? What you're about to witness is one of the most shocking confrontations in daytime television history. The moment when Reba McEntire, a woman known for her warmth, her grace, and her unshakable, the studio fell silent. The audience held their breath, and Joy Behar discovered that some women are far more dangerous when they speak softly than when they shout. Before we dive into this explosive story, make sure to subscribe and drop your thoughts in the comments because, trust me, you're gonna want to talk about her music, who had cried to fancy and found strength in Is There Life Out There, who saw in her story a reflection of their own dreams and struggles. Whoopi Goldberg opened the segment with obvious enthusiasm. Our next guest is a true American treasure. She's sold over 75 million records, starred in her own television series, and is currently helping discover the next generation of talent on The Voice. Please welcome the one and only Reba McEntire. The applause was thunderous, the kind of genuine warmth that couldn't be manufactured. Reba stood briefly to acknowledge the audience, her hand over her heart in a gesture of gratitude that had become her trademark. Well, thank you so much. Y'all are gonna make me cry before we even get started. Sarah Haynes asked the first question about The Voice, and Reba's face lit up as she talked about her contestants, the joy of mentorship, the privilege of helping young artists navigate an industry that could be brutal to newcomers. She spoke with the kind of authentic enthusiasm that had made her beloved for 4 decades. You know, when I was starting out, I didn't have anyone to show me the ropes, Reba explained, her Oklahoma accent warm and unhurried. I made every mistake you could possibly make. So, if I can help these young people avoid some of those pitfalls, that's the greatest gift I could ask for at this point in my career. The conversation flowed naturally, touching on her music, her upcoming tour, and the secret to staying relevant in an industry that often discarded artists after a few years. The audience was engaged, nodding along, connecting with every word. This was the Reba they had come to see. Then Joy Behar leaned forward, and the energy in the room shifted like a cold front moving across the prairie. So, Reba, Joy began, her voice carrying that unmistakable edge that regular viewers knew meant trouble. You've been doing this country music thing for, 40 years now? Don't you ever get tired of singing about the same things? Pickup trucks and beer and broken hearts? It all seems a little limited, don't you think? The question landed with a thud. The audience went quiet. The other hosts exchanged uncomfortable glances. Reba's smile remained in place, but those who knew her well could see the slight tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible stiffening of her posture. Well, Joy, I think country music is about a lot more than trucks and beer, Reba replied, her voice still pleasant but now carrying a careful undertone. It's about real life, real struggles, real people trying to make sense of this crazy world. That's what connects with folks. Joy waved her hand dismissively, a gesture that seemed designed to minimize everything Reba had just said. But that's exactly my point. It's so narrow, it only speaks to a certain type of person, doesn't it? I mean, when was the last time country music had anything meaningful to say about the real issues facing this country? Several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sonny Hostin's eyes widened slightly. Even Whoopi, who had seen plenty of controversial moments, seemed caught off guard by the direction Joy was taking. Reba took a breath, her decades of media training kicking in as she formulated a response. Joy, I think you might be surprised by the diversity of stories in country music. We sing about love, yes, but also about loss, about faith, about overcoming adversity. I've recorded songs about domestic violence, about women's empowerment, about the struggles of working-class families. Those are real issues that affect real people. Working-class families, Joy repeated with a slight smirk. You mean the people who vote a certain way and believe certain things? Let's be honest, Reba. Country music has become the soundtrack for a very specific political demographic, hasn't it? It's basically propaganda with a guitar. The accusation was so pointed, so deliberately provocative, that several people in the audience gasped audibly. Alyssa Farah Griffin looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. Sarah Haynes was staring at her notes, clearly wishing she could be anywhere else. Reba's famous smile flickered, and for just a moment, something harder showed through. When she spoke, her voice was still controlled, but there was a new quality to it that the audience had never heard before. Joy, I've spent 40 years bringing people together through music. My concerts have Democrats and Republicans sitting side by side, singing the same words, feeling the same feelings. Music isn't about dividing people, it's about connecting them. And I'm not going to sit here and let you reduce my entire genre, my entire life's work, to some kind of political talking point. But Joy wasn't backing down. If anything, she seemed energized by the tension she had created. I'm just pointing out what everyone can see. Country music has become increasingly political, increasingly narrow in its appeal. And artists like you, with your wholesome image and your down-home values, you're part of that. You're selling a fantasy of America that doesn't really exist anymore. The words hit the studio like a slap. Reba's posture changed, her shoulders squaring in a way that anyone from Oklahoma would recognize as a warning sign. When she spoke, her voice had dropped slightly, losing some of its musical warmth. A fantasy? Let me tell you about my fantasy, Joy. My fantasy was growing up on a cattle ranch where we worked from sunup to sundown just to keep food on the table. My fantasy was riding in rodeos because that was the only way I could get noticed as a singer. My fantasy was losing 8 members of my band in a plane crash and having to find the strength to keep going when all I wanted to do was give up. She paused, letting those words sink into the suddenly silent studio. That's not a fantasy. That's my life. That's the life of millions of people who listen to my music because they see themselves in those stories. And you don't get to sit there in your New York studio and tell us that our experiences aren't real just because they don't match your idea of what America should look like. The response was powerful, delivered with the kind of quiet intensity that was far more impactful than shouting. But Joy inexplicably pressed forward. I'm sorry about your tragedy, I really am. But you can't use personal loss as a shield against legitimate criticism. The fact is, country music has a diversity problem. It has an inclusivity problem. And artists who have been around as long as you have, who have the platform you have, should be doing something about that instead of just perpetuating the same old narratives. Reba's eyes flashed with something that looked very much like anger. A diversity problem? Joy? I've spent my entire career fighting for women in country music. When I started out, women weren't supposed to headline tours. Women weren't supposed to sell out arenas. Women weren't supposed to have the kind of career I've had. Every door I walked through, I held open for the women coming behind me. She leaned forward, her voice gaining strength. I've championed artists of every background. I've used my platform to lift up voices that the industry wanted to ignore. So don't you dare sit there and lecture me about inclusivity when you've never walked a mile in my boots. Joy crossed her arms, her expression hardening. I'm not lecturing. I'm asking questions that need to be asked. You've built an empire on this wholesome, sweet Southern belle image. But how much of that is real, Reba? How much of that charm is calculated? How much of that accent is just part of the brand? The question was so insulting, so deliberately designed to wound, that the audience actually murmured in disapproval. But Reba didn't flinch. Instead, something shifted in her demeanor. The warm, accommodating entertainer who had walked into the studio that morning was gone. In her place was a woman who had survived things that would have broken most people, and who was no longer interested in being polite about it. You want to know if my accent is real, Joy? Reba's voice was quiet, but carried a weight that filled the entire studio. This accent comes from a place called Chalky, Oklahoma, population 200. This accent comes from helping my daddy work cattle before the sun came up and doing homework by kerosene lamp, because we didn't always have electricity. This accent comes from a life you couldn't begin to understand from your apartment in Manhattan. She stood up slowly, her full presence commanding the room in a way that reminded everyone why she had been filling arenas for 4 decades. You want to know if my charm is calculated? Let me tell you about charm, Joy. Charm is what you learn when you're a woman in a man's industry, and you have to smile through every slight, every dismissal, every man who tells you that you're pretty, but you'll never make it. Charm is what gets you through the door when talent alone isn't enough. And yes, I've used it. Because that's what survivors do. We use every tool we have. Joy tried to interject. I'm simply questioning whether the image matches the reality. No. Reba's voice cut through the studio like a knife. You're not questioning. You're attacking. There's a difference. You've spent the last 10 minutes dismissing my genre, my audience, my authenticity, and my life's work. That's not journalism. That's not even good television. That's just mean. The word hung in the air, simple and devastating. Joy's smirk faltered, replaced by something that might have been embarrassment or might have been the beginning of anger. "I think you're being oversensitive," Joy said, but her voice lacked its earlier confidence. "These are legitimate questions about authenticity and representation in media." "Oversensitive?" Reba laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Honey, I've been called every name in the book by people a lot meaner than you. I've been told I was too country for pop and too pop for country. I've been told I was too old to be relevant 20 years ago. I've survived a plane crash that took people I loved like family. You think a few snide comments from someone who's never created anything are gonna make me oversensitive?" She shook her head slowly, her disappointment visible. "You know what the real shame is here, Joy? You had an opportunity. You had a chance to have a real conversation about music, about art, about what it takes to stay relevant for 4 decades in an industry that chews people up and spits them out. You could have asked about mentorship, about legacy, about how the music industry has changed. Instead, you chose to be dismissive and condescending, because that's easier than actually engaging with someone whose experience is different from yours." Whoopi finally attempted to intervene. "Maybe we should redirect this conversation to something more positive." But Reba wasn't finished. The floodgates had opened, and years of graciously deflecting criticism with a smile were giving way to something far more powerful. "No, Whoopi. With all due respect, I think this needs to be said." She turned back to Joy. "You asked if country music speaks to real issues. Let me tell you about real issues. I've sung about women leaving abusive relationships. I've sung about single mothers working 2 jobs to feed their kids. I've sung about people losing their faith and finding it again. I've sung about the quiet dignity of ordinary people living ordinary lives. Those are real issues. They might not be your issues, but they're real to the millions of people who find comfort in those songs." Her voice was rising now, filled with the passion that had made her one of the greatest performers of her generation. "And you know what? Those people you dismiss as a certain demographic, they're nurses and teachers and truck drivers and farmers. They're the people who keep this country running while you sit here making clever comments about them. They deserve to have their stories told, and they deserve to have those stories treated with respect, not sneered at by someone who's never bothered to understand them." Joy made one more attempt to regain control of the conversation. "I never said those people don't matter. I'm just pointing out that country music has become increasingly insular, increasingly what?" Reba interrupted, her voice sharp. "Increasingly popular? Increasingly successful? Country music is one of the fastest growing genres in the world. We're selling out stadiums on every continent. We're breaking streaming records. Artists from every genre are incorporating country elements into their music. If that's insular, then I don't know what mainstream looks like." She took a step closer to the desk, her eyes locked on Joy's face. "But that's not really what bothers you, is it? What bothers you is that country music represents values you don't share. What bothers you is that millions of people find meaning in songs about faith and family and hard work. What bothers you is that there's a whole world out there that doesn't need your approval to exist." The observation was so accurate that Joy actually flinched. Her defensive posture tightened, and when she spoke, her voice was strained. "I'm entitled to my opinions about music and culture. That's what this show is about." "You're entitled to your opinions," Reba agreed, her voice dropping to something quieter, but somehow more powerful. "But I'm entitled to point out when those opinions are based on ignorance and prejudice rather than actual knowledge. You've revealed today that you don't know anything about country music except the stereotypes. You don't know about the artists pushing boundaries, the songs tackling difficult subjects, the way the genre has evolved over decades. You just know what you've decided to believe, and you're not interested in learning otherwise." She straightened her jacket with the calm precision of someone who had made a decision. "I've been doing interviews for 40 years. I've talked to thousands of journalists, and I can count on one hand the number of times I've been treated with this kind of disrespect. Not because people agreed with me, but because they at least did me the courtesy of engaging with who I actually am, instead of who they'd decided I must be." Joy opened her mouth to respond, but Reba held up her hand with an authority that silenced the entire room. "I'm going to tell you something my mama taught me a long time ago, Joy. She said that when someone shows you who they are, believe them. and you've shown me exactly